Good morning. I'd like to introduce the project Mechanisms of Pacific Decadal Variability, or PDV, in Earth System Models. This is a project with 3 PI, myself, Emanuele Di Lorenzo, Sam Stevenson, and Matt Newman. The goal of this project is to identify and compare the mechanisms that energize tropical and extratropical Pacific decadal variants in each of the CMIP5 Earth System models. And 2, to diagnose how these mechanisms are projected to change under anthropogenic forcing using large ensembles. Now, with that in mind, we have developed 2 mechanistic hypotheses of the processes that contribute to Pacific decadal variability that are constrained through observations. The 2 sets of hypotheses, one is related to tropical Pacific decadal variability, or TPDV, and the next one is extratropical Pacific decadal variability, or EPDV. And I'd like to spend a little bit to talk about these hypotheses. Now, hypothesis 1, which is for tropical Pacific decadal variability, says that seasonal stochastic variability of extratropical ENSO precursors is reddened by ENSO and its teleconnections into decadal variants. So let me explain this a little bit, and we're going to do that by first quantifying the contribution of ENSO precursor to actually tropical Pacific decadal variability. To do that, we're going to start by defining an index of ENSO during the peak season of ENSO, which is in October, November, December, or the fall, if you like, fall, winter. And so this is just the first principal component of sea surface temperature in the tropical strip, plus or minus 5 from the tropics degrees. And this is essentially an index of El Nino where you see these different peaks. Now we're going to put this into the context of an hypothesis, and in particular we're going to essentially compute the so-called ENSO precursor patterns in the atmosphere. And this is done by taking this ENSO index in October, November, December and correlating it with the preceding sea level pressure anomalies in January, February, March, which are shown here for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. If you look at these patterns, and I'm sorry there's no values here in the correlation bar, but if you look at these patterns, you see that they're both associated with the weakening of the off-equatorial trade winds. Now, these weakening of off-equatorial trade winds have been identified as important in a whole bunch of ENSO precursor dynamics, which are listed here. These include things like meridional modes, trade wind induced charging, off-equatorial excitation of off-equatorial Rossby wave, and so forth. So we know that these off-equatorial trade winds, in fact, are important in exciting or energizing the tropical variants, and in particular ENSO. So what we can do now is we can essentially take these patterns of sea level pressure anomalies and project them back on the sea level pressure anomalies of January, February, March to develop indices of these precursors, which are shown here in blue for the northern hemisphere and in magenta for the southern hemisphere. Now, what's interesting is that these seasonal precursor indices are not correlated with each other. And this is a finding that was also reported in several other papers. And this essentially, the fact that they're uncorrelated suggests that indeed these are independent of the tropics and are actually perhaps acting to energize the tropics and not vice versa. So with that said, what we can do now is a simple exercise of making a linear model where we combine these 2 precursors shown here. So we can reconstruct ENSO with multiplying the first precursor by 50% and the second precursor by 50% and reconstruct essential tropical variability. This is an exercise that other studies have done when looking at these ENSO precursors, and the correlation of 0.6 is significant but not unprecedented. The next thing that we can do is we can think about ENSO. We know that once we have ENSO in the tropics, we then have teleconnections that take place in the fall and then impact the higher latitudes in the north and southern hemisphere in the following winter, JFM plus 1. And so we have these essentially these ENSO teleconnection and so forth. So the idea is that we have this path from the ENSO precursors into the tropics and back into the extratropics. So this essentially is a path that allows for the reddening of the internal stochastic variability that happens in both the northern and southern hemisphere. And so I call it reddening because this kind of path from the extratropics to the tropics to extratropics provides essentially a long-term memory, because it takes about almost 2 years to complete the cycles from the growth of the decadal variants to the peak to the decay. So the hypothesis then is that seasonal variability of these extratropical ENSO precursors is reddened by ENSO and its teleconnections back to the tropics into decadal variants. So the next thing is instructive to now look at the spatial pattern of the precursor in the sea surface temperature fields, which is essentially the oceanic expression of these precursors. And here are correlation of those precursor indices with the sea surface temperature anomalies during JFM for the northern precursor and the southern precursor. And you can see that these two patterns are actually quite different, and of course intensify, one in the north and one in the south. If we now take the same precursor indices and we correlate them with the temperature in the January, February, March that follows, we find that these two patterns now have a much more higher degree of symmetry, and they look more like each other. So essentially what's going on is that you start with a precursor in one hemisphere, and then through the anisotelic connection, that variance gets transferred into both hemispheres. And so the idea is that this type of dynamic is really responsible, or is at least an important contributor of the tropical decadal variability. So the question now is how to quantify the decadal variance that is explained by these extratropical precursors. Well, if we go back to the index of the ENSO reconstruction from the precursors, which is just, essentially a linear model of the two precursor indices, half from the north and half for the south, what we can do with this index, we can actually low pass this index and create, essentially extract, if you like, the low frequency variability that is associated with the seasonal precursors. And so we'll call this the ENSO precursor Pacific decadal variability. Now we can compare this with the standard index of the low frequency variability in the tropics, which can be evaluated by taking the 8-year low pass sea surface temperature in the tropics and computing the first principal component plus or minus 5 degrees from the tropics in latitude. And if we do that, we find that in fact this precursor decadal variability correlates very strongly, explains a large fraction of this tropical Pacific decadal variability index, suggesting that indeed the phasing of this low frequency variability in the tropics may be connected for a large fraction to these extratropical stochastic forcing that get reddened through these dynamics of coupling between tropics and extratropics. So with that said, of course, there's other sources of stochastic noise, both in the extratropics, but also in the tropics that could energize ENSO in this case. And so we will consider also those in our hypotheses. And so this is essentially a quick summary of our tropical Pacific decadal variability hypothesis. And there are two papers that explain this in more depth. And just to recap this hypothesis, the idea is that the sequence of ENSO stochastic precursors to ENSO peak to anisotelic connections, essentially this loop, is a mechanism to integrate the short memory, seasonally varying stochastic forcing from both the extratropics and the tropics into Pacific decadal scale variance. With that said, we also have a second hypothesis that really focuses on the extratropic. We call this the extratropical PDV hypothesis number 2. And this is mostly found in the paper by Newman et al. In 2016. And to summarize that hypothesis, the idea is that modes of North and South Pacific decadal variability, like PDO or the South Pacific PDO, are the results of a collection of drivers and processes. Among the drivers, we have the atmospheric internal and external forcing. Some of it is stochastic to the high latitudes. Some of it may be related with anisotelic connections that acts essentially on some memory dynamics, which are several. In this case, we are considering like ocean reemergence, which provides memory in the mixed layer, ocean Rossby waves or westward propagating Rossby waves in the high latitudes, and also tropical extratropical teleconnections. So now that we have these two hypotheses, the question is how to evaluate these mechanistic hypotheses in a framework that could be used, for example, with the Earth system models. And the diagnostic toolbox that we will develop is essentially a set of empirical dynamical models, or EDMs, of the Pacific decadal variability. And these diagnostic toolbox is going to use on the historical simulation of the CMIP models to essentially understand in each model, essentially the goal would be to compare the mechanisms that energize the Pacific decadal variability in each models rather than just comparing the patterns. Now this toolbox will actually be made available for the community along with some tutorials so that other groups can decide to use it if they choose so. As an example of using this an EDM, in this case a linear inverse model from Matt Newman's paper in 2016, where he decomposed the Pacific decadal oscillation to different type of modes. These are the ones that comes from the tropics, like Central Pacific and Eastern Pacific El Nino, and then a more North Pacific modes. And so this is just one first example and one first step of really decomposing the decadal variance into different modes and then understand in more depth the dynamics of these modes. Another going back to this framework, in addition to the CMAP models, we will also want to evaluate how these mechanisms change under climate change or under anthropogenic forcing. And to do that, we're going to rely on large ensembles, which allow us to essentially robustly diagnose if these mechanisms are really changing. It's hard to do it in single runs. To complement these large ensemble, the project is also going to develop a new ensemble or small ensemble with the DOE E3 system model. And this will also become available to the community and will be distributed on a data server at Georgia Tech. Now, in addition to this EDM diagnostic toolbox, we also have planned additional analysis toolbox. One is a set of hybrid simulations that couple an Earth system model with an empirical dynamical model, and this allows to test specific links that are outlined in these hypotheses. And the next one is also a budget analysis for the feedbacks that are important in energizing the variance. And in particular, this is an example from a recent paper by Sam Stevenson in 2017, where she analyzed how the changes in ENSO feedbacks are different between the 20th century and in the 21st century in two large ensembles. One is the community Earth system models and one the GFDL. And here are the different type of feedbacks: surface heat flux, upwelling, thermocline, and zonal advection. And you can see, if you look from one model to the other, that these models energize ENSO in different ways. And so this is going to be an important way to actually understand the mechanisms that generate the variance in these models. So to conclude, our project will essentially analyze both existing CMAP runs that are available and also large ensemble, and will generate a new small ensemble with the DOE Earth system model, which will be made available. And to do the diagnostics, we'll be developing these empirical dynamical models, EPDV, and also these budget analysis for feedbacks, which will be made available to the community along with a set of tutorials. And this is all we have. Thank you again. These again are the 3 PIs of this project. And I also want to acknowledge Luc van Roek, who from one of the Los Alamos labs, who's also going to help in the generation of these simulations. And so I will leave you with this slide. Thank you.